Go ahead.
More softly. Really.
Ridley Fire.
We are live.
Okay. Good morning. Today is Thursday, February 15th, 2024, it's 9 a.m. This is meeting Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're continuing our work on Bill S213 and Act relating to the regulation of wetlands, river corridor development and dam safety. We've been in touch with the Environmental Justice Office at the Agency of Natural Resources, and we did a series of technical difficulties yesterday. So we're going the old-fashioned way, people in person and in the committee rooms. Good morning, Senator Watson. Hope you're feeling better.
I'm feeling better than yesterday.
All right. Well, that's in the right direction.
Right. Progress.
Yeah.
So where's the camera? Right there. I see never watch.
We have back with us again today, Mr. Mundy, as well as Ms. Kusimel, and sometimes we always choose how they would like to provide testimony. If you want to pull up two chairs and speak side by side, or if you want to go one after the other, and completely up to you. And I think in terms of things we would like to learn about is, we didn't really get through sort of all the way through a general discussion of EJ and where you're at, but we have roughly half an hour. And then we're also trying to evaluate, and I don't know if you can comment on the agency's evaluation of the EJ, sort of potential EJ impact of performance of 213, which we're currently drafting. But it is, I realize, you wrote a memo, although 3 days ago is not that long. That's also 3 drafts ago on the bill, and we have 2 more between us and voting tomorrow. So it's a little bit of a moving part. So if you'd like to join us for game for hearing the thoughts on EJ and 213.
For each of us or just? Is that a new one or? Is that a new one?
No, this seems to be a,
Oh.
so first of all, for the record, my name is Carla Raimundi. I'm Director of Civil Rights and Environmental Justice for the Agency of Natural Resources. And I am accompanied by my coworker, Megan Kusiel. I just shared with you one of the deliverables of the Vermont EJ law, which we're gonna be touching upon because it provides principles for community engagement. I'm sorry, that came from a collaboration of the interagency committee and the advisory council. And so this document is gonna be central to the discussion that we will be having today. I have more copies here. Oh, I can hang this up.
Do we have it electronic?
Yes, it's on the website.
Yes, we do. But I thought bringing hard copies is never a bad idea.
Yeah, exactly.
This is an older version of it, is it? No, they're just the documents that go together. Oh, they go together. Yeah, they go together.
Could you make sure you send those electronically?
I will, for sure, yeah. If you can take a note, I have it up. Here, there's another copy.
I think so. I find this interesting, that's a line. I'm not sure it's now.
They seem to have different public meetings.
They don't, they haven't said.
Yeah, they're different.
Okay.
Okay.
Actually, I do.
Copy?
Thank you.
And I'm just gonna check in since the large document, if we're half an hour, and we have a presentation that fits, or we need to schedule more time for.
I think we have plenty of time.
Yeah.
Yes. Although I would definitely welcome another invitation to come to committee and talk further about environmental justice law. And environmental justice generally. So
Trained my eyes to look because we had someone a few weeks ago had a slide deck of 59 slides. And their scheduled time really was 20 minutes. And I was thinking, okay, well, this, one of these things is not gonna fit.
I will be mindful of time and I'm gonna try to cover what I intended to cover within the time allotted.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chair,
Senator John.
I was late yesterday and did the introduction yesterday. But we passed an environmental justice law. And, your governor signed it, and it's now the law.
Yes,
And when we pass laws that deliver environmental justice, they're vetoed. That's the problem we need to overcome. We know what environmental justice, we think we know what environmental justice is, but we've got to get, 2/3 of us have to vote for those, otherwise they get vetoed.
Oh, so, Senator McDowell, I
That's
appreciate,
my opinion, but maybe that needs a committee.
appreciate the perspective. I'm gonna add our witnesses, guests to respond to the policy moment.
Help us get over that hump.
well, luckily, we have the Vermont Environmental Justice Law, and that was enacted in 2022. Okay, well, good morning, I'm Chair Bray and members of the committee. Many thanks for the opportunity to provide testimony regarding applying an environmental justice perspective of S213, an act relating to the regulation of wetlands, river corridor development, and dam safety. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Carla Raimundi, and I work with the Agency of Natural Resources in the capacity of Director of Civil Rights and Environmental Justice. My approach today will be to contextualize my written testimony that was submitted to you several days ago, 3 or 4 days ago, by grounding its content on relevant parts of the Vermont Environmental Justice Law, or Act 154 of 2022. Several clarifying notes. I will refer to the environmental justice law as the EJ law and environmental justice as EJ. And then the 9 agencies covering the environmental justice law will be referred to as covered agencies. And so my approach today will be a 3-part conversation. The first part, I will share an overview of the relevant aspects of the Vermont Environmental Justice Law that will help us inform this conversation. I will cover the definitions that are relevant for the conversation, environmental justice, burden and benefits, meaningful participation, and then briefly discuss the advisory council, its role and membership. And then the policy, which is relevant for the work of this committee and the legislature in general. And then the second part, I will focus on the deliverables, 2 specific deliverables of the law, the community engagement principles that will inform community engagement plans for the covered agencies. And really briefly touch upon the burden, the cumulative burden deliverable within the law. And then part 3 of this conversation, I will wrap it up with a cute bow, hopefully. And then I'll pass it on to my coworker Megan Cousineau, who will share with us an example of what this could look like on the ground as it pertains to S213. Okay, so first of all, the Vermont Environmental Justice Law, as you all know, was enacted in 2022. It created the policy for environmental justice for the state of Vermont. It created 2 bodies, one of which is the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And that council allows us to hear directly and engage directly with members of most impacted communities in Vermont. It also created deliverables to advance EJ in Vermont and provides working definitions for several important and relevant terms for this conversation. First, the purpose of the environmental justice law is to identify, reduce, and eliminate environmental health disparities to improve the health and well-being of all Vermont residents. The policy of the state of Vermont declares, and there are two parts to the policy that was created in the law. Number one, part one, is that no segment of the population in Vermont should, because of race, culture, or economic makeup, bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens or be denied an equitable share of environmental benefits. And these are terms of art that we will define later on, but are important for considering impacts of policy. And then part two of the policy is provide opportunity for the meaningful participation of all individuals. There's an emphasis on environmental justice focused populations in the law. In other words, it's centering policy making, agency action, government action around environmental justice focused populations in the development, implementation, or enforcement of any law, regulation, or policy. As you can see, this really comprehends all branches of government. And development of the law is the legislative endeavor. And so some of the definitions included in the Vermont Environmental Justice Law that are relevant for contextualizing S213 and generally the work of government in general are environmental benefits. The law defines benefits as assets and services that enhance the capability of communities and individuals to function and flourish in society. The law then provides a myriad of examples of what that looks like. And then it also captures environmental burdens. And the definition in the law for an environmental burden is any significant impact to clean air, water, and land, and also includes destruction, damage, or impairment of natural resources resulting from intentional or reasonably foreseeable causes. This is important because it gives you a sense of the scope of what would be considered an environmental burden. As it was done in the environmental benefits definition, there are examples of burdens contained within the law. Here, it is important for government, including policymakers, to realize that what is believed from one perspective to be an issue or a burden is not necessarily the case from all perspectives. It's situational. Relative positions of individuals matter in this evaluation, whether there's an environmental burden or whether there is an environmental benefit. Therefore, the initial identification of a potential burden and the potential solution from a standpoint of effective policymaking should be vetted by those who are impacted by the potential burden that's been identified by a particular policy and the solution. Then the law also defines meaningful participation. And meaningful participation is defined as the means that all individuals have the opportunity to participate in decision-making processes, and that includes energy, climate, environmental. And it requires that communities are enabled and administratively assisted. And this is particularly meaningful in the context of what's required of government to ensure that communities are provided meaningful opportunities for meaningful participation. So ensuring that language access is provided, that materials are produced in plain language, that efficient and effective technical assistance to support informed participation is provided. Also creating opportunities for public comment, conversations on policy and rules, and engaging in potential solutions for the issues that have been identified by the given policy. Additionally, meaningful participation in the law requires the state to operate in a transparent manner with regard to opportunities for community input. What that means is communicating, any action that the government may take in a way that can be accessed by all members of the communities. And here I would like to distinguish engagement versus meaningful participation, community engagement versus meaningful participation. Community engagement really seeks to engage communities to achieve sustainable outcomes, equitable decision-making processes, and deepens relationships and trust between government organizations and communities. And trust is really an underlying concept and quality that underpins any conversation around environmental justice, just ensuring that we're holding ourselves accountable and are acting in a way that can be reliable and is grounded on trust is of particular importance. The emphasis in community engagement and is on lived experiences of community members, recognizing that there's knowledge that is gathered by community members that have not had an opportunity to share that knowledge in a meaningful way. And local knowledges inflecting decision-making processes challenges a top-down approach to public decision-making. Moreover, it holds the promise that meaningful public participation can influence decisions like the ones being made here. And that it really impacts provisions of services, visions for the future, visions for what is sustainable, for what is resiliency. And so that's the second part of the brief overview for the Vermont Environmental Justice Law. Now I would like to talk about one of the bodies that the law created, and that is the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. This council provides independent advice and recommendations to state agencies and the General Assembly on matters pertaining to environmental justice, including the integration of EJ principles into state programs, policies, regulations, legislation, and activities. And I'm gonna repeat this part is the Environmental Justice Advisory Council is tasked with making independent advice and recommendations to state agencies and the General Assembly on matters relating to EJ, including the integration of EJ principles into state programs, policies, regulations, legislation, and activities.
Ms. Remini, a quick question.
Sure, Senator.
You folks, I think, are the first to go, but the idea of EJ was that it would, when we were doing the bill, that it would spread across all agencies and departments. It shouldn't just be A&R, the word environment happens to be front and center for both. Have you started, are you connecting with other agencies outside of land management? And are they standing up parallel efforts, or are they asking your office to help them with their EJ assessment?
Yes, thank you very much for this question, Senator. As part of the Vermont Environmental Justice Law, as I mentioned at the beginning, the law created two bodies, the Advisory Council and the Interagency Committee. And the Interagency Committee is comprised of 9 other agencies and, well, 9 agencies, including the Agency of Natural Resources and the Office of Racial Equity. And the covered agencies, all of the covered agencies are tasked and responsible for implementing all their deliverables within the law. The Agency of Natural Resources has been specially tasked with providing technical assistance to the Advisory Council and to the other agencies in advancing the implementation of the deliverables that are included in the law. So the answer is yes, Senator. through the engagement process and the doing of the work, we've been meeting regularly with other agencies and the advisory council to ensure that we are all setting up the structures that are necessary to implement effectively the deliverables within the law. There is the question, of course, of resourcing, which is always an important conversation to be had. This law tasked the agencies with creation of many processes that are necessary to implementing the deliverables. And so that really requires resources internal to each of the agencies.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so going back to the advisory council, which is the other body created by the law, the sectors represented in the advisory council are municipal government representatives, social justice organizations, mobile home community representatives, and my coworker will, Megan Cusino will talk more in depth about AMHCs. Environmental justice focused population representative is a member of the advisory council. Food security organization is represented. Immigrant communities representative is also a member. Statewide environmental organizations, Vermont Native American Tribe representative, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and the Natural Resources Conservation Council representative. And there's also a member of the Office of Racial Equity who's part of that advisory council. So these sectors are now organized in a structure that allows for these voices to be systematically centered and engaged in the work of government, in the development, or should I say co-development of policy for the state. And a way in which the law creates those opportunities is through the creation of deliverables. The one that I'm going to focus my attention today is the creation of community engagement plans and principles, because we are hearing directly from the most impacted community members in Vermont, those individuals who have unfortunately not being part of decision-making processes and decisions really that directly impact them. Now there's an opportunity through the creation of this group to hear and center those voices. And we heard from this group as a collective, and the first deliverable of the law is the creation of community engagement principles. And in a nutshell, the covered agencies, those are the 9 agencies covered by the law, must create and adopt community engagement plans guided by the principles that were created through the implementation of the law. To provide opportunity for meaningful participation of all individuals with particular attention to environmental justice focused populations. The community engagement plans themselves will include and incorporate the core principles that were created through this iterative process between these two bodies, and take into consideration the recommendations of the EJ Advisory Council. And most importantly, describe how the agencies plan to provide meaningful participation. What's relevant about this deliverable here is that we now have a document with guidance from these sectors of the population telling us what comprises good and effective community engagement and the values that we should hold ourselves accountable to ensure that we're actually meaningfully engaging with those sectors of the communities who have been most impacted by decision-making processes and by environmental events. The way that their knowledge and expertise was gathered was through the creation of the principles. And so there has been an identification of 12 principles to guide the creation of community engagement. And so some of the values captured by these principles, preferred by the advisory council, are community input at every stage, building resiliency and trust, committing enough time to do engagement well, and show up on the ground and work towards equitable solutions alongside community members. And so after touching on those principles that have been identified by the advisory council as representative of these communities, I will pass it along to my coworker Megan Cusino, who can speak to how this would look on the ground, based on experience from the Department of Environmental Conservation in doing this work. Right, Megan?
Great, thank you.
Good morning, Chair Bray and committee members. Thank you for having me here to contribute to this discussion around providing an environmental justice perspective on S213. For the record, my name is Megan Cousineau. I'm the Environmental Program Manager of the Environmental Assistance Office in the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And I'm also the department's Environmental Justice Lead. For today, I prepared some testimony that I'd like to read into the record. Carla asked me to join here today as DEC's Environmental Justice Lead to provide an example of why ground truthing, community engagement with frontline and most impacted residents, meaningful public participation opportunities, and data review of the potential impacts are all instrumental in providing an environmental justice perspective for this bill. I just want to iterate before I go deeper into my testimony that we're not here to try to stall or stop any progress. We just want to add this perspective to the conversation today. As Carla has mentioned and provided in her testimony, environmental justice principles compel the consideration of who is most impacted by a proposal and to evaluate the benefits and burdens the proposal would create on those impacted. This also includes determining whether any negative impacts would disproportionately affect a certain sector of the population. One sector of the population that may be disproportionately impacted by this bill are manufactured housing communities, which are also known as mobile home parks. Those two terms get used interchangeably. Manufactured housing communities are one of the sectors represented on the EJ Advisory Council, as Carla mentioned. In the state, manufactured housing communities are an important source of affordable housing and an opportunity for home ownership for over 7,000 households. A statewide survey conducted by researchers from UVM in partnership with CVOEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity Mobile Home Program, in 2011 found that the median income for households located in manufactured housing communities was $30,000 per year, compared to the statewide median household income of $49,500 a year. The study also found that 40% of households in manufactured housing communities have incomes that would be considered extremely low or very low, as defined by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Further, a 2014 UVM-led study on rapid flood exposure assessment of Vermont mobile home parks following Tropical Storm Irene found that nearly 32% of all mobile home parks in the state have some of their land in floodplains. And more than 20% of all mobile home parks have at least one house in the floodplain. And that's statewide, nearly 12% of mobile homes in parks are in floodplains. So that's just to highlight that there's a potential for impact at a greater level to MHCs because of their proximity to floodplains as it relates to S213. We've seen as a sector, manufactured housing communities have been heavily impacted by recent flood events, both the 2023 flooding and Tropical Storm Irene. According to Rejoice, which is an environmental justice advocate group in the state, MHCs make up 8% of the state population, but 40% of those that were affected by Irene. And we also saw in the July 2023 flooding that there were 5 manufactured housing communities that needed to evacuate and 14 that were impacted. So from an environmental justice perspective, there is a benefit to consistent and equitable regulation and management of floodplains and river corridors, and improving regulatory standards would benefit all Vermonters, especially those living in and near those areas, such as the case for many manufactured housing communities. However, when we focus our attention on those potentially most impacted by the proposed legislation, we also might find that these individuals are now limited in their ability to navigate the permitting process with the additional requirements, and that compliance may be more difficult to achieve for reasons such as affordability and lack of available technical assistance. And one thing that Carla acknowledged in her written testimony, that it's important to recognize that one person's benefit could be another person's burden. So what we would need to do is an environmental benefit and burden analysis, community engagement with these frontline and most impacted communities, and meaningful public participation opportunities with MHCs and other homeowners in floodplains and river corridors in order to receive their valuable experiences and to learn more about the potential impacts, both negative and positive, of this bill on those different communities and sectors. It's also crucial to identify that this engagement and analysis work takes time and should be done earlier in the process in order to inform decision making. Vermont DEC in general has already started the process of applying an environmental justice lens in our floodplain work that helps us to highlight the importance of community engagement and meaningful public participation opportunities. In June 2023, right before the flooding that happened in July, UVM and CVOEO submitted a Vermont MHC flood risk assessment report to the Vermont Rivers Program. DEC had commissioned this report through FEMA's Community Assistance Program, as the program had identified the risk to manufactured housing communities as a frontline community from flooding due to their geographic locations and their socioeconomic vulnerabilities. This assessment featured a resident engagement component to explore concerns, challenges, and opportunities for improving community resilience to flooding risk using a resident-centered approach that promoted equity and dignity for residents. Key insights from this report included, as a critical housing option that's affordable in a state where housing costs, especially for lower income Vermonters, are especially challenging, MHC residents have acknowledged the socioeconomic vulnerabilities they faced when discussing flood risk. The residents shared their concerns for their neighbors living near the edge in terms of their limited financial resources to weather a storm, and that these limited financial resources are a barrier for emergency preparedness and mitigation steps, as well as a barrier when it comes to permitting and compliance requirements. It's also important to consider strategies for engaging residents in MHCs with higher flood risk potentials in the dialogue to raise awareness and encourage preparedness, while recognizing that many of these households actually lack the financial resources to do any of the work that's needed. And we should just consider that notion that it's going to continue to apply to any additional requirements that are put on them. Recommendations from this assessment included giving priority to MHC residents based on their valuable lived experience and firsthand knowledge of their communities, promoting dialogue and exchange of views rather than a one-direction flow from an expert to a resident. This requires early engagement with the community prior to making decisions that will affect them. And then also identifying methods and tools to enable manufactured housing communities and their residents to effect changes to substantially improve their safety and well-being through using an equity-centered approach to hazard reduction. So just to summarize really quickly, through this brief review of the manufactured housing community sector, we know about 1 in 3 manufactured housing communities have some land in a floodplain, and there may be some potential impacts from this proposed bill on them. We also know that this sector may have issues with complying with additional requirements without additional technical support, outreach and education, and funding. Further, this review of the existing research, map data, and past engagement efforts with manufactured housing communities reveals why ground truthing, community engagement with frontline and most impacted communities, and meaningful public participation opportunities are so important. An even deeper dive into the potential impacts on MHCs as well as other potentially impacted populations living within flood corridors and floodplains and river corridors by this bill is needed to fully scope out the potential environmental justice impacts, both positive and negative. The general goal when providing an environmental justice perspective is to assist in the development of a policy that advances legislative objectives while also meeting the actual needs on the ground and not disproportionately burdening any sector of the population. And to do this well, we need thoughtful timelines and resourcing of efforts. Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to speak on this topic today.
We can just do a little housekeeping first. And you, could you send your written testimony to us committee system that way? We don't have, rich and detailed, and love to be able to have it so I could read it and take it in more slowly. The other thing that will be helpful, you also mentioned some reports. So the reports I'm familiar with so far as we've been doing our work is the inequities and distribution report that you cited in your letter of the 12th. And then we also have an earlier report on the viability and disaster resilience and mobile home ownership and parks from post Irene, housing and community development. Did you mention the third report? And second, could you send a link
Yes.
to that, please?
Yes, I was planning on putting together like a 1 or 2 pager of some full links to reports to send in based on the questions we got today.
It'd be great, because we have a lot of paper in the room, and
Yeah.
it's always helpful when someone can help us make sure we don't have anything fall through the cracks. Very much. I'm also feeling fortunate that your program is housed in A&R, and A&R is, of course, one of our main partners for a lot of the bills we do. And we've been talking from the outset about how to have enough community outreach, engagement, mapping work, etc. So really, someone said, what's the sequence we're talking about? It's mapping, meeting, and managing. And so you start with developing maps. There's also a community engagement. That's what it's calling meeting for shortening, and then the program itself, the management phase, is the last phase, which pretty much all the aspects of the bill we're looking at this point are well into the future. You know, some people wish they were sooner because the threat of the flooding is on us already, and whether the rates originally out in 7, 28, 30, something like that. So anyway, that's a long line in saying, I'm glad that as we write laws but don't implement them, can count on the expertise you all bring to the very agency that will be implementing the laws. But we are more fortunate than other committees that don't necessarily have for their jurisdiction an already established EJ team. Thank you for that. And we, I'm mindful of time, we're running a little behind, and anyone in the committee want to ask questions before we everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for coming today. I was a major proponent of the environmental justice bill. And I come from a low-income community that is in White River Junction. And we have experienced flooding time and time again. I'm wondering because, well, I so appreciate you taking the time to describe your process and some of the concerns that you have with the bill. I think I'm struggling to understand kind of what recommendations you would make for improvement on the bill. So is there specifics that you saw in the bill? Like with the outreach timeline, or maybe how we can work with the council to actually implement some of this? Were there specific recommendations or language changes that you had?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, Senator. And I was informed that there's gonna be a meeting with program staff who would be implementing the bill should it get enacted later today. So in order to form an opinion regarding concrete recommendations to advance environmental justice, or whether those processes would hinder an effective engagement process, I think after the meeting today with staff, after they have an opportunity to review the latest version of the bill, we may be able to offer some precise recommendations.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, great. And when you say program staff,
The program staff within the Agency of Natural Resources in charge of the
So like
flooding.
Mr. Evans.
okay, yeah, so some of the folks we've seen before,
Correct.
those program staff.
Yeah,
Okay.
those program staff, yes. So they will review the latest iteration. I'm sure they will have already had. So in order to be responsible with recommendations, I would like to have an opportunity to meet with them and see
Okay.
what their feedback is regarding. But as a general consideration for what you mentioned, Mr. Chair, is in considering, in thinking through processes, and now we have this document that I shared with you and will gonna provide links to. Community engagement and the considerations that go into those processes. We have recommendations from the advisory council on how to do that. And how to do that effectively so that we're actually achieving what the intention is. So reviewing those principles, I think, will create a better sense of what it would look like on the ground to engage in this process. And then with regards to the mapping, what is important to think through is that the maps that exist currently, the visualization data that exists is not necessarily accurate as compared to ground truth exercises on the ground. And there's research in other states comparing, for example, CGIS tool, the most recent tool created by the federal government to advance implementation of Justice 40. And there are some factors that are not captured by that tool on the ground. And Vermont is a very special state because it's rural. And so, the expansiveness of the land does not necessarily capture the volume necessary for individuals to be captured by the maps that exist to assess impacts on the ground. So then thinking through a process and a timeline that would allow to actually ground truth the data that's being captured by the tools that exist is incredibly important. And we do now have access to, these sectors of the communities in an organized fashion via the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So there are ways in which we can think through ways to tap into the expertise and the knowledge on the ground to ensure that what is intended to be advanced is actually getting advanced, not to the detriment of certain individuals who, for where they're situated, they're not able to participate meaningfully in these dialogues.
We have taken a lot of testimony on mapping, I know that it's complex and one of my notes to myself is maps are political, the use of maps is political. And so we've been hearing from agency staff as well as from the RPCs, as well as from municipal staff, that we need to have a really robust conversation to do the ground truth thing that you're talking about, not just physical accuracy for where floodplains do or do not go because things move, but also who lives there. So I think I'm 101% confident that we have the same goal. I think what we're iteratively working on is to make sure that the bill we pass, which is really a blueprint for action, not the action itself, lays out a plan that will be successful for all parties, including fully engaging people in the way you're describing. And my last word to you.
Oh, thank you, Chair Bray. And again, thank you so much for being here. And I wanted to ask specifically to your example around manufactured homes. While they're not the exclusive group that you would be dealing with to actually implement environmental justice principles, I think they are the most poignant. I wanted to ask, because I have some real fear that if we don't move forward with this bill, we're actually going to be doing the opposite of supporting environmental justice principles, which is continuing to place our most vulnerable people in high-risk flood zones. When I look at our communities, like in Woodstock, we were one of those evacuated manufactured home parks. And they don't have any tools in their toolbox as residents to make a clear case that they should not be building back in those locations. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to why we wouldn't move forward with this bill, because it does
prevent, I think, the most traumatic situations for vulnerable Vermonters, which is having to have a buyout. I mean, I spent some time going through the report that you mentioned, and the main underlying point that I heard was, please don't move people unless you really have to move them. And if you are going to move them, do it with them and with a process. So I'm wondering why the regulatory framework that we've identified in the bill wouldn't actually create that rather than the status quo, which just says, keep on building right there, keep on putting vulnerable people in those locations. And, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator. I think in the, when considering the environmental justice perspective in the case of this bill and in the case of manufactured housing communities, there is a certain balance, like broadly speaking, and I don't want to dive too far into the bill because that's outside of my jurisdictional knowledge, but there, from what I understand, there's kind of different parts of like what we want to do going forward. And then also what I think we're also trying to advocate for is like also think about the people that are there.
Yes.
So it's like the one thing of looking at not doing anything in the future, but also like in that, are we creating burdens for the people that are already there and don't have a lot of mobility?
Sure.
I know in one of the reports that we sent in, I think it was that 2013
Yeah.
one, it mentions how there are a lot of challenges around relocation.
Yes.
And those range from social challenges and the disruptive nature that it can cause to residents to the financial, just like can't actually afford the cost to do it, as well as the land use challenges and trying to find new sites is really difficult.
Yeah.
So in all of this, what we're recommending today is like just having the ability to do that environmental benefit and burden analysis and review as soon as possible in the process, because we're not saying that the bill creates burdens, we're not saying it creates
Right.
benefits. What
Thank
we're
you.
saying right now is that we don't know what the potential impacts will be, so there needs to be more consideration of what it'll actually look like on the ground. And in order to do that effectively, we need to be engaging with those most impacted residents, such as manufactured housing community residents. And one of the documents that I'll be sending in is that the most recent, the 2023 engagement, because that one really focused on engagement, and there was a common theme throughout it of how much the residents appreciated being engaged and understanding what and how policies might impact them. So I think, just back to my first point, is like, we're not trying to stall anything, we're not trying to stop anything, we're just trying to say this perspective is really important in the decision-making process. And in any ways we can weave it in to really understand the full scope of the benefits and burdens will just be beneficial from an environmental justice perspective.
Well, that's really refreshing to hear, because it did concern me, some of the points that you raised in the memo, because it felt a little bit like, well, I agree, we should always be including those voices. In fact, they should be at the forefront, and was the main reason why I was so supportive of this bill, was hearing directly from my folks who are stuck in situations where they're unsafe. And not having anything that they could put in their toolbox to make a case for not having those homes in those locations. So that really is where I think the impetus for this bill comes from. So I so appreciate that you've come out, what sounds like in favor of the bill, but with some concerns that we need to integrate more of a relationship between the Environmental Justice Council and kind of that education and outreach process. So I really appreciate you taking the time to express that.
If I may say something, I think from where I sit, in thinking through environmental justice and what I understand of the bill, I think the recommendation is not either in favor or opposed.
Okay.
The goals of the bill are shared in terms of the protective nature of those living in certain areas. The extent to which that's done and the allowances within the bill, that's really the expertise of program staff. And so those individuals who would be implementing the deliverables or implementing the rules within the bill. And so I would defer to those individuals to make an assessment of whether what's the goal in the bill will actually get advanced by what's proposed
within the bill, taking into consideration resources that exist at the agency currently. Taking into consideration that the way that you communicated, the intention of the bill is to actually engage in a meaningful process of ensuring that those individuals who may be impacted by it are considered, informed, and engaged. And so that's a conversation really that right now we would require more resources to
Yes,
be able
for
to have it considered in the way. So I think that we're being compelled by the Vermont Environmental Justice Law to be more thorough with the evaluation of the impacts of our work, executive, legislative branch, judicial branch. We really need to think about what we are intending to advance, that those things that we're looking to advance are actually issues on the ground for those individuals who are living through those circumstances, and that the solutions that we're coming up with here are actually dispositive of the concerns that exist on the ground. And from where we're at right now, at the stage of the implementation of the Vermont Environmental Justice Law, and given the tools that we have to our avail, making that evaluation right now is very difficult.
Oh, okay.
To make. And so this would really require an exercise in engaging directly with those members of the community.
And you've definitely got some very good reports that did just that I think speak to some principles.
Before going, sorry, before the final question, so let me back up to think through something you were saying about meeting with policy staff. So you bring the environmental justice expertise to your colleague. Is part of your review with them, say, you help them see what implementing with EJ entails. And so they can look at the technical side of things and say, okay, if we're gonna not overlay, we're gonna mesh an environmental justice perspective in it. Now let's rethink the bill, reevaluate the bill in terms of timelines and resources, so that we might hear, once that process is over, what would be like suggestions for changes to the bill, so that it's all it sounds well.
Right.
It sounds from environmental justice.
Correct, sure. Correct. That kind of engagement has been actually formalized within the agency. In the process of implementing the Vermont Environmental Justice Law.
Yeah.
It's really important for me as the Director of Environmental Justice and Civil Rights that our programs, whenever they're asked by the federal government to consider environmental justice and equity principles, that we take the time to have conversations with staff regarding the nuances of programs.
Sure.
And so that we can understand what potential impacts, including those principles. The principles are positive in nature. The extent to which those principles get embedded in programs through rules and standards that get incorporated, that's a whole different question. And that really necessitates conversations with folks on the ground. So that we're not recreating the issue,
Right.
Thinking that there's an issue and then coming up with solutions.
Right.
That may not be embedded. But yes, and so we've created a review process within the Department of Environmental Conservation to ensure that principles of environmental justice are advanced.
So your pending policy meeting is really where you'll sort through, bring the EJ evaluation metrics, or I don't know what exactly how you do it, to the bill as drafted with technical staff, and they can say, oh, well, it's one thing to do this technically, it's another thing to do this well and in accordance with the EJ law. And so we'll, I think, for the committee to hear back, what kind of adjustments. The other thing is, first stage of the bill's development, the off. Suspect that honestly, the bill will be worked on right through till just shy of a journey. So there'll be many more iterations, and I feel confident that legislative side and on the side and sides of long term. Work was in the work, but then we'll keep the dialogue going and keep improving the bill over time.
We trust that it will be like that.
Yeah, Senator McCormick, now really the last question is to you.
And Mr. Chairman, I am appreciative of your efforts to keep on something resembling the schedule. So, thank you, and I'll try to be brief. I appreciated your presentation, the history, the law, the structure, the philosophy of your activities. And as a policy writer, most of my dealings with agencies or with there comes a point where now we're gonna make it legal. Okay, and I contacted Susanna Davis, who was our racial equity our equity director.
Yeah.
And what she pointed out was the bill as written, because I just said, what am I missing in this bill? I was hearing rumors of grumbling in the BIPOC community, but I wasn't getting any testimony. Rumors of grumbling. And I said, what are the problems with this? And he said, well, it's capital intensive. It presumes large scale operations. It's going to be corporatizing, and the people going to do a cottage industry are pushed out. And that issue came up, and I think we have at least we've at least identified that problem and attempted to deal with it. So I guess what I'm getting at is I am looking to you for the information on actual specific lines of pending legislation. Look at what you missed. That's what we need to hear. Because we move well.
Yeah, yes, and I appreciate your comment, and I would like to wrap up my contribution today by saying that one of the values that really permeate environmental justice is the value of trust, the value of transparency. And you know, in the development of that trust with community members, I think we should, you know, emulate that, you know, and develop trust between the branches of government. And so I do agree with you. We do mean well as well. And I know you do. And so this is really a great conversation. I hope the first of many, and I will do my best to provide you with what you're looking for. Thank you.
I love the saying from the disability activists, there's nothing about us without us.
Correct, nothing about us without us. Yes, yeah, that resonates very much.
Well, thank you again for Senator Dunn.
I was, your title was,
I'm the environmental program manager of the Environmental Assistance Office
for agency to,
for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation.
so we had a LCAR hearings on the use of wake boats. I don't know how much a wake boat costs. And it revolved around the use of people with very expensive boats driving around on Vermont lakes, making it tough on people who, you know, use canoes and other things like that. And it seems to me that would be a place for someone who. Particularly what the your agency's recommendations were. Or someone who's an environmental person and justice person to have been there. Did you get notified about the area?
I was not involved in that hearing.
Well, it's. Mr. Chair, when I came into this hearing, I was gonna want to bring up Jones Beach in New York, where. A fantastic beach was developed and bathhouses and this, that, and the next for the citizens of Long Island and around. And the design had bridges. Where you approach the beach and buses couldn't fit through the bridges, and it was not an accident. Which meant, I'm just showing the gentleman here. The Jones Beach thing about how the place is full, sorry you couldn't get in, but or capacity, hope you have a nice weekend. And it's the people with cars that go to Jones Beach, and it's the people that don't have cars, that are the ones that show up and get the sign that says we're full. As a matter of just practice. And that's your challenge. You've given a textbook correct presentation. Respect. You have studied how to give testimony, and you are some patriots and star pupils. Find out how to get in the trenches and put what you know and believe and your understanding of law to work. Because that's where the action takes place. And then.
You're
and
opening
don't-
my
and don't-
in Elkhart.
And put your energy into that.
Yeah.
We can pass environmental laws that tell us what we're supposed to do. Doing it requires something.
So that's it. Thank you for that. We could have a long, interesting conversation and, but today we can't follow up on that. So thank you, Senator McDonald. And thanks for helping us. And we'll look forward to hearing back from you and other agency staff as we continue to work on the bill and it continues this way towards a full passage in roughly 60 days or something like that by the time we're all done, something like that. All right, with that, we have two other witnesses to follow on technical points in the bill, different areas, not related directly to EJ.
Which one, this is the one that you need, this one, you have one happy with this.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Chair and Senator Salvo.
Great. With that, I'd like to go to Ms. Remick from the Office of Property Valuation and Review. Thank you for your patience. So I had sent you a note flagging just one particular section of the bill. It's a study on the possible deployment of UVA as a tool in helping serve floodplains. And it's a study, so it's not written on the part of the department to undertake that work, but we would like to UVA has been a valuable, maybe one of the most valuable tools we've had in the toolkit to help keep green spaces green and affordable for those who need to pay tax on them. So we're really contemplating sort of, and we're usually focused on farmland, forest land, but now we're wondering about the potential application of it for floodplain, for instance. And so I don't know if you have any comments on the responsible or the details of how our study committee is set up in the bill.
Sure thing. Good morning. My name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department. Are you folks able to hear me okay? I should have just walked over.
I'd appreciate it a little louder.
There we go. I just put it up.
We turned it.
I just finished. Here we go. We're all set.
Okay, how about now? Can Can you folks hear me okay? Okay, great. So yeah, my name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department. One of the many parts of our small but mighty team's role at the Tax Department is overseeing the current use program. So I was asked to just weigh in on section 26 of the draft bill. It caused me to do a little bit of research about what the current treatment is for flood corridors and floodplain management, which is not something I'm as nearly as well versed in as the folks in that room. I think in short, I don't think current use would necessarily be the right path to go. I think there are other more straightforward mechanisms for reducing property tax liability for these places that would not involve current use. So as you folks know, the use value appraisal program or current use is designed to protect Vermont's working landscape and open landscape. It is a major commitment for landowners. Basically, there are really strict requirements for participating in the program. The state puts a contingent lien on that property, and in order to remove that lien, there is a land use change tax, which is not insignificant. So there are other existing treatments to reduce the property tax liability if that's the intent of looking into this, right? So there are some existing statutory language regarding easements. So for example, hydro dams have flowage easements where basically they actually have that sort of easement on the properties for a 100-year flood. And so that is absolutely does impact the value of those properties and reduces that property tax liability. There's also some state law about other ways in which, for example, and again, I don't understand the exact construct of what the floodplain management land would be, if that's a state designation or something like that. There are other statutory pieces that basically you can put a conservation easement or other easement on the property that the lister and assessor would then reduce the value. And that seems like a more straightforward way to address this. The other piece is there's actually a lot of land related to floodplain management already enrolled in the program. A few years ago, the definition of agricultural land was actually expanded to include riparian buffers. So we do have a lot of those, right, pastures and croplands and things like that along rivers are already eligible and already in the program. On the forestry side, there's also what's called ecologically sensitive treatment areas. That's another way that wetlands and other floodplain management could be addressed. So I think there's pieces there already. That being said, also, I totally understand the desire to do this study. I do want to just caution we're undergoing some pretty significant studies already regarding the reappraisal structure in Vermont, the whole education statewide property tax, grand list maintenance and reappraisal. So we have a pretty huge amount of work on our plate already. So I'm not sure that we could dedicate, I think the language basically assigns all the work, the legal support and things like that to the tax department to do this study. We're happy to be help and be good partners, but I'm just not sure we're really going to be able to provide the level of rigor that you might be looking for this.
Okay. Well, and so thank you for that. You know, the contingent lien and how it ends up creating a significant barrier to leaving. And I think that sort of stability is something that I think we're actually interested in. You know, like that it's not necessarily sort of in out, that it's a longer term commitment because for instance, the river corridor is going to be the river corridor for a long time. I don't know how many 100 years the models are good for, but it's a long-term commitment. So and Senator Watson has her hand up. This was actually her brainstorm. So let me go to Senator Watson.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. I have a question though about the easements. We've heard in other testimony that that including floodplains in current use might be complementary to the easements, and the reason was because the easements program were more permanent. And actually, I'm having a hard time remembering if this was something that I heard in testimony or if this was just a conversation I had. So my apologies if it's not actually in testimony, but my understanding was that easements are they're more permanent, right? Like it's ongoing. Whereas current use, you can be enrolled, you can be unenrolled, and like fair enough, that might be a very long period of time. But if someone's maybe not ready to make the commitment of going the path of an easement, that current use may be a good option for them in the interim. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I think the idea, and again, I am not a floodplain management expert in any way. I'm barely a diesel expert. So I'm not seeing the land that I think this would apply to that would be in current use. I don't see the use of that changing, so I'm not sure it's opening up current use to this big of a change from what it currently is. You're going to want to hear from a lot more people about whether current use is the right mechanism. Like I said, I think if the idea is to reduce property tax liability and have folks leave this property alone, there are ways that I mean, an easement I think can have an expiration as well, but there are other ways that there can be restrictions put on property by the state or federal authorities that would reduce the value and therefore lower folks' property taxes and encourage them to keep that land as it is.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
We have to go to the floor shortly because we're having a joint assembly. So I think Senator Watson, would you be willing to follow up with Ms. Remick offline? Because I think the concept is sound, maybe the way we've expressed it at the moment, it's not quite on target, but let's keep working on the idea, which to help manage those spaces in a stable way that also doesn't leave people drawn to developing in order to realize a profit off that land when in fact that land could be is susceptible to flooding. And modified development pressures compared to trying to keep green spaces green that have a flood mitigation function. All right, so sorry to sort of be somewhat short on this, we'll keep the conversation going. We have one more stop before we have to leave the room, and that is we've got Mr. Gerard on the line with us. We just need to check in briefly on encapsulated polystyrene flotation device. Thank you, Ms. Remick. So, Mr. Gerard, thank you for following us along. We've been on multiple topics longer than we thought before getting to you. If you could just introduce yourself for the record, and our question is just to get some frontline report on the use of polystyrene foam in flotation docks, and if you the bill contemplates only allowing encapsulated polystyrene foam floats, and we want to find out if that is works for your business. Maybe that's something you have to do, or maybe it'd be highly problematic. Sort of trying to get a read from the street on it.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me this morning. Chris Gerard from the Dock Doctors, general manager and partner. Been with the company 18 years. I've been in the marina industry for probably a tad over 26 years. So I've got a lot of experience with old school floating dock construction and state of the art of today's era. My draft of the bill with the mandate of encapsulated flotation units and is spot on. I think it's falling very consistent in what we've seen in New Hampshire and what the state of New York is pushing. And I think the state of New York isn't across the board with Department of Environmental Conservation. It's more regional at the moment. But I think it's a great place to start. And I think for the most part, when I look at the number of properties that I visit from Maine to New Hampshire to Vermont to New York and other places, I would say Vermont is getting less and less of the pink and the blue and the white encapsulated styrofoam that's under these wood docks that might be 20, 30 years old. So I'm still seeing them quite a bit in concentration in other states, but it's good to see that Vermont is slowly getting up to the new era of docks that are on legs and docks that are on wheels and docks that are on floats, having them be encapsulated.
Okay, great. So I think, to be really direct about it, our sense is it's a good idea from an environmental point of view, and we just want to make sure that we're not creating an unintended hardship for people in the business.
Not at all. I mean, you would be joining basically, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has had a standard in place, 36 CFR, part 327.3, which excludes the use of raw foam and empty barrels for floating docks anyway. So it's what the industry standard should be using. The manufacturers, the industries, as being good stewards of the lake, whether we're designing and working on it or we own property on it, we should be inspecting those floats a couple times annually. And if the exterior encasement is broken, then there should be some skin in the game for making sure that's repaired and not letting it get to the point where the styrofoam is leaking out and becoming a concern that obviously the bill is addressing.
Great, well, thank you for your testimony, thank you for your patience. That completes our testimony. We're